But now we want to turn our attention to another, what really is a major issue, but it's not being covered like a major issue in the U.S. South, specifically in Mississippi, more specifically in the Jackson, Mississippi area, Hinds County there. 215 bodies were found in unmarked graves there in Jackson, Mississippi. There's a lot to it. I wish it was being more reported, but nonetheless, we're very, very honored to be joined by the Reverend Kiana Jones, who's a community organizer in Atlanta, Georgia, to talk more about this. Reverend Jones, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be with you on the freedom side.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And I get my first question for you in a way is, I hate to even say this, but I mean, were you surprised? I think everyone was shocked by the story, but were you surprised to see a story like this? 215 bodies, mainly poor people, buried in secret graves, essentially, in a state like Mississippi?
Honestly, no. I was not surprised to hear a story like this. We know our history here in the South. We know our history in the United States, and we know that unmarked graves are not uncommon anywhere in the United States because every state has a so-called pauper's grave. But what is surprising is that in Jackson, Mississippi, many of these people were not without family, were not without next of kin or a way to contact them. So these families were robbed of the right to put their loved ones away, to rest in their final peace properly and with dignity. And when you think about that, I think that really speaks to the larger overarching issue of dignity and who is seen as a person worthy of being recognized by humanity. We know that the majority of people buried in these paupers' graves from state to state are Black people. This sends us the message that Black people are not worthy of humanity, that we don't deserve dignity, that even in death, they want to rob us of every small bit of humanity that we have. And then you think about the people in those graves, like Dexter Wade, who were buried with identification. Dexter Wade had a state ID that listed his home address. Dexter Wade's mother had reported him missing since March. It wasn't revealed until later, many months later, that Dexter Wade was actually hit and run over by an off-duty police officer. This is egregious. This is not something that should be allowed to continue. And it really pains me that the leadership in Jackson, the leadership wants to gloss over this and talk about a failure in communication. And now, we're going to make sure that there's an alert system where people can be notified if their loved ones, happen to be at the coroner's office and nobody's there. Well, where was your alert system already? Is that not already part of your policy that you will seek the next of kin, that you will try to notify someone that their loved one is there in the coroner's office, that they are seeking to make final arrangements for these people? But what I find is a lot of song and dance, a lot of posturing, and a lot of glossing over the fact that there were over 200 unmarked graves. And look at where they are. At the prison. And these graves are so shallow that buzzards were flying around. You don't even give people enough respect to bury them in any type of coffin. You're not embalming the bodies. You're just throwing body bags in the ground and covering them with dirt. What does that say about how you truly feel about the people who you're just throwing into these graves?
I just wanted to note, when you mentioned Dexter Wade, his mother told NBC News that she had hesitated. It took a lot for her to even call the police initially to report him missing, because her older brother was killed by police a few years earlier. So and you mentioned, I mean, he was also killed by police and he had identification on him. And when I first saw this story, I saw, 200, over 200 bodies found in unmarked graves. This must be like from 100 or 200 years ago or something. Like nobody knew there was this mass grave or something. And then I was just, I mean, even, that's horrifying enough, of course. But then to see that these are people who are just being killed in different ways, different Black people being killed in different ways, and just the police department, local authorities just don't care about notifying their families. And then they're having inmates. That's the other aspect of this story. I mean, you mentioned it a bit about this being behind a jail, but can you talk a bit about the people who were digging these graves and actually doing these burials?
Absolutely. Initially, when I heard the story, I myself almost dismissed it because I immediately assumed, oh, these are inmates being buried here who they can't reach the next of kin. That was my assumption. I actually thought that in 2023 that would be the case. But when you think about a person that's already been sentenced to a life where they are not treated as human, where they have no dignity, to take that same person and put them into a position where they will have to dig a grave that might end up being their own fate. The trauma that people must be experiencing, the thoughts that must go through the minds of the inmates who are forced to do this labor. But could you imagine that some of those inmates might be coming across the bodies of people they know? What happens when you see your neighbor and you're digging a shallow grave and just throwing their body in there? What happens when it's someone you grew up with or a family friend? What happens? And then what happens to the quality of life of that inmate that's already caged, that's already being treated like less than human? What hope do they have? Because now they have images that they will never get out of their minds. An image that I'm sure they fear might someday be them.
I mean, it's horrifying to think about on just basically every single level, quite frankly. And I thought the point that you made about the leadership there, just sort of glossing it over, I felt, similar with the water crisis, all these different pieces. I mean, it really talks about, I think, another major issue here in the South that sort of, quite frankly, regardless of race, how poorly served the communities, especially working class Black communities, are by the political class. I mean, you're based in Atlanta. We've seen the Cop City debacle be pushed by these people. Obviously, we're mentioning Mississippi. We could go on and on to every state, but that really just feels like an important factor coming up here on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, this upcoming Monday, the national holiday, is how just, I don't even really know what to call them, but just how disappointing, so much of the, political class in many of these places that's supposed to be part of this, new democratic dispensation that we got after the civil rights movement, how disappointing a lot of that has turned out to be.
Absolutely disappointing. I commonly call them the Black misleadership class. What they are proving to us is you cannot stack the deck Black and think that institutions that were created on racism and that are sustained and driven by racialized capitalism are going to change simply because Black faces are running the system. Just because you put Black faces into the mix does not mean that that system is going to completely change from what it was designed to be. What we see, again, a mayor, Chokwe Lumumba, Black mayor, legacy, name recognition. People thought that this was the great Black hope. Here we are in Jackson, majority Black city council. I mean, we got the dream, right? We're going to be okay because we have Black people looking after other Black people. But we have to remember here in the South, particularly, the legacy of whipping boys, how there were Black people who oversaw other enslaved Black people. There were Black people who contributed to making sure that other enslaved Black people were caught by slave catchers. There were Black people. There has always been a Black misleadership class to throw us right out into the open where we can be ravaged by a system that was never meant to care for us, to promote us, to nurture us, or to give us any dignity. And it's really, really disappointing and extremely disheartening that, particularly here in the South, this continues to perpetuate itself because we keep electing people just because they look like us. And I'm so tired of having to tell people that representation is not enough. And do you even represent me if you don't embody the same values, if you don't have the same political ideology, if you don't believe that every person is worthy of dignity and respect, if you believe that somehow a person's financial class should determine how well they are treated in this life, then you can't possibly represent me. And if you continue to make agreements with the white supremacist establishment just for a seat at their table and a place in this horrendous system, then you definitely can't represent me.
I wanted to ask about if you could talk a bit about this other case out of Mississippi where there was an 11-year-old child shot and killed. Well, wait, was he killed?
Just shot.
Okay, I'm sorry. Wow. Well, he was shot in his home by a police officer who was responding to a call. And that police officer who shot a child in his home, I just want to emphasize that. Shot a child in his home, reinstated, right? Reinstated after being suspended. Can you talk a bit about that case as well?
Here we are once again in Indianola. We have a full Black board of aldermen and mayor who reinstate a police officer who arrives at the home of young Adarian Murray when Adarian himself called the police. And forgive me if I get a little emotional on this one, y'all, because it hits close to home. Because my mother was a victim of domestic violence. And I remember calling the police more times than I can remember. And the times that they showed up, the way we were met by them, how we were treated, how my mother was criminalized even though she was the victim, and how, because of the treatment of these same officers, she was dehumanized even in death. So you have young Adarian Murray who calls the police because his mother's ex-boyfriend, who is known to be violent, shows up at the house, calls the police for help. I would venture to say that many young children these days still believe that 911 is the number that you call for help. They still believe that police are supposed to serve and protect. But when this officer showed up at the home of Adarian and his mother, the way he showed up was wrong from the beginning. The tone with which he spoke to them, he's just yelling, "Where is he? Come out. Everybody come out." I mean, Adarian, 11 years old, comes out with his hands up. Comes out with his hands up to show, hey, I'm innocent. I'm not doing anything. I'm complying. I'm listening because I trust you, officer. But that officer immediately shoots this 11-year-old boy, collapsing his lung, fracturing his ribs. I mean, lacerated liver, 11 years old. 11 years old. And all he could remember was blacking out and singing at some point. But at 11 years old, he now has stated in interviews that when he's alone and he's thinking, sometimes he just sees himself lying in a coffin. He sees himself dead. And what is that for an 11-year-old to look forward to or to have to be afraid of? But for the municipal government of Indianola to reinstate that officer, you reinstate an officer who shot and has wounded an 11-year-old boy, who has permanently traumatized Adarian and his family. And I would venture to say a lot of other 11-year-old boys who look just like Adarian. But these are the type of people that you would have on your police force. And what we see is that whether it's in Indianola, whether it's in Atlanta, whether it's in Minneapolis, the life of a Black child doesn't seem to matter much. And it really hurts because what this shows is that Black children are never seen as innocent, no matter what.
Couldn't say it better than that. Just 11 years, reinstate the guy. Let me not go on a rant. Well, as always, the Reverend Kiana Jones, community organizer from Atlanta, Georgia. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me.